The world we live in can be a minefield of confounding, confusing, and conflicting peaks and valleys. Have you found yourself exasperated and bewildered to the point that you threw your hands up in the air and declared, "I can't literally even"? Well, never fear, novices. Your postgraduate studies in life start here. I'll be your sage on the side for those ups and downs. I'm Professor Moose, and I'm going to help you learn to even. This is not, I repeat, this is not a D&D podcast. Dungeons and Dragons. We talked about it on a previous episode. We'll probably talk about it a little bit tonight. But before we get into that, what's everyone been cooking? I realize, we haven't all been able to go out to eat. I know that I like to go out to restaurants, and it hasn't been quite as accessible as it usually is. Things are starting to, open up a little bit. But, for the most part, most of us have either been picking up stuff, bringing it home, or cooking at home. And if you're adept at cooking at home, I think that's pretty handy, pretty easy. Of course, there are a lot of people that are not. So how do you learn to cook? Well, most people that learn to cook are, taught by someone. It's not one of those skills you can just sort of pick up on your own. I mean, I suppose you can, but, it would require a lot of research, a lot of experimentation, practice, things like that. I learned to cook from my parents. And I remember the first thing that I ever learned to cook, like really cook, put together without any kind of recipe, was scrambled eggs. And, scrambling an egg, believe it or not, is actually a pretty crucial skill. Gordon Ramsay sort of measures a chef by how they, scramble an egg. I remember, I was taught, you put the butter in the pan, you crack the eggs in a bowl, you whisk them, stir them with a fork till there's no streaks, throw in a little salt, throw in a little pepper, put it in the pan, and just let it sit for a second, and then you sort of stir from the outside in towards the middle. And as the egg begins to cook, it will sort of stick to the pan a little bit, and you sort of scrape the bottom of the pan until things are soft, but not quite, they're starting to firm up, but they're not quite solid. And then before they look like they should be done, you plate them up. And the carryover heat continues to cook the eggs on the plate. And that should leave you with scrambled eggs. Once you learn to cook scrambled eggs, then it's easy to sort of move on to other relatively easy things. Pancakes are another good next step. For me, and I imagine probably for many guys, once you're sort of over that hurdle of being able to be trusted in the kitchen with, an eye or something like that, there sort of comes this, I'm going to call it a manly rite of passage, but it is by no means, gender specific. But, learning to cook on the grill is a big thing. And I imagine it's probably big everywhere. I mean, I don't know, and maybe not so much in, dense cities. But, in a rural setting, especially, or suburban setting, where most people have a grill, then I think it's an important skill to learn. And it's also sort of one that we use to measure machismo to a certain extent. But you learn how to build a fire. You learn how to, first you learn things like hot dogs and hamburgers, because those are easy. If you destroy a pack of, $3 hot dogs, then, it's $3 hot dogs. You haven't burnt to a crisp a beautiful piece of dry aged Wagyu beef or anything like that. You eventually learn to up your game. You get to where you will, graduate beyond lighter fluid, and you start using a charcoal chimney, and then you buy yourself a really nice grill. Then you learn to cook with indirect heat, and then maybe you go in the direction of becoming sort of a pit boss. You learn about smoking meat, which is something that I love to do. I'll do it on occasion, occasionally share those products with friends and family and stuff like that. It brings me a lot of enjoyment. It brings other people a lot of enjoyment. I like to do it. So you learn things about, sauces. You learn things about dry rubs. How long it's going to take to smoke something. If you're just going to throw together some ribs or some chicken leg quarters, then, 4 or 5 hours probably get you where you need to be. However, if you're going to smoke like a Boston butt or a picnic ham or something like that, then you're looking at bare minimum 12 to 18 hours. There are people that will start it off on the smoker, bring it inside and do it in the oven. And I've got, no lack of respect for those people. Not everybody has the time to just babysit a fire, because that's what you're doing. You build a fire, you get it to a certain level, you put the meat on the smoker. And this is, assuming that you're doing things the way I do with, a natural wood or wood charcoal mixture of smoke. But, you got to check on that fire, every hour, hour and a half, 2 hours maybe. You got to go out there and, feed it a little more, because you don't want a big fire to start with. If you have a big fire, you're going to have, the outside is going to be toast, and the inside is going to be, it might be where you want, but you're going to ruin and dry out the outside. Ideally what you want when you're smoking a piece of meat, when you cut a cross section, you want, really tender, thoroughly cooked, juicy meat in the middle. You want what we call a smoke ring, which is sort of a reddish pink ring around near the exterior, and you want a good bark or a good crust. And that's the outside where the fat of the meat has essentially sort of air fried the surface. There's a lot of flavor there. That's also where your rub is concentrated. So like in the case of a Boston butt or pulled pork, you come in, you take that inside, you let it cool for a few minutes. If there's a bone, you remove the bone and you pull it or chop it, shred it. And what you're doing is you're homogenizing it so that every bite of that barbecue, every bite of that meat, you've got a little bit of meat, you've got a little bit of smoke ring, you've got a little bit of bark. And so you've got a lot of flavor in every single bite. And, it takes practice, it takes time, it takes skill. And everybody, every region of the country that barbecues thinks theirs the best. And they won't, they won't hear of anything else. Texas barbecue tends to focus on beef, a lot of times brisket, but also Texas barbecue usually has sort of a tomato-based sauce that's usually a little on the hot side. Then you've got like Kansas City barbecue, which focuses on another sort of tomato-based sauce. It's usually a little more well-balanced. Memphis barbecue, at least as I've experienced it, is usually sort of a sweet heat kind of sauce. They'll dry smoke things like Boston butts and ribs, but they'll usually have, sauce available. And then you get South Carolina barbecue, where it's the sauce is very vinegar intense, very tangy, very sharp. And then in Alabama, they have this thing called white barbecue, which is, barbecue that is dipped in, soaked in, or cooked with a barbecue sauce made with mayonnaise, which looks, I don't know, I just can't seem to get past the look. I'm sure it probably tastes great. You know, I've got no opposition to mayonnaise, but just watching the sauce made puts me off a little bit. I don't know. It just doesn't quite sit right to me mentally. I'm sure if I tasted it, I would probably change my mind, but I'm not going to go to the trouble of making it. But, you know, we've been cooking at home, and we've been cooking on the grill. Usually something easy, the occasional steak, some smoked sausage, split open, grilled, occasional hot dogs. We haven't gotten too fancy in quarantine. We have, you know, in the past we've done shrimp, lobster, crab, surf and turf, you know, lots of veggies, lots of bread on the grill, things like that. But, you know, in the sort of era of quarantine, you know, with our schedules being sort of thrown out of whack, you know, mealtime has lost all meaning. For example, this morning I got up, I woke up a couple hours before my wife, and I just laid there in bed scrolling through things on my phone, and eventually I woke her up and, you know, decided it was time for some breakfast. She wanted some food, and so I went in and I cooked her a couple of pieces of bacon, some fried eggs, a little toast. But that wasn't going to do it for me. The only thing I wanted at that time was condensed chicken noodle soup. And so I had an enormous bowl, 2 full cans of chicken noodle soup and an entire sleeve of saltines for breakfast. It really scratched an itch. I don't know why. But you know, it's traditional breakfast foods, traditional breakfast times, sort of means nothing. I ate breakfast. I sat around for a while, and then I guess about 1 o'clock, I went and took a nap and slept till about 4:30. Got up and I made dinner. And for dinner tonight, we had turkey spaghetti. I also did some meatballs, garlic bread. We've started using ground turkey in place of ground beef in a lot of things like spaghetti, tacos, anything where the meat isn't really the feature. It's just sort of a delivery device for sauce. But yeah, so, I mean, you know, what have you been cooking? We have a presence now on Twitter, on Facebook. You know, so I would love to engage. If you're listening to the show, leave us some comments. I'll try to take those and include them in episodes. But as I said at the beginning, I stated that this was not a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. And this episode might, you know, touch on that, but I don't want it to become a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. Because when you, I mean, it's something I love. It's a hobby I love. I enjoy playing. I've played and ran the game for many, many years, but it's also something that it's divisive. Everyone who is familiar with it, everyone who has played it or plays it regularly, has their own opinions, has their own preferences, and they certainly want to engage with you about the subject, to tell you how yours is wrong and theirs is right, or convince you one way or the other. So I got started playing D&D around 1996. I have a friend, and we'll call him Marshall. Marshall was running a game with some other friends of mine, and I didn't know anything about it. And I'd heard of Dungeons and Dragons before that. I knew some people in high school that played it, but I didn't know anything about the game, other than the sort of, you know, popular myth stereotype that it was something sort of semi-occult. it was a game where you had to buy a lot of books and, stuff like that. And so I didn't know anything about it. And I was raised, at least from sort of junior high on, I grew up Southern Baptist. And I like to tell people that I grew up Southern Baptist, but I escaped. And so, anything that wasn't clearly within the boundaries of acceptable sort of going on in a Baptist church, I wasn't, didn't have any part of until I got to college. And so, I stumbled across my friends playing this game, and, I'd heard of it, had no idea, but they were all getting together on a regular basis. And when I say a regular basis, I mean, at least 3 or 4 nights a week. I went to college in the town I grew up in, which is Cleveland, Mississippi. It's a sleepy little, dusty little Delta town, much like the song says. And, at the time, there was not a lot available for, a young person to do outside of, just getting drunk and partying, and that was kind of your option. There weren't many bars. There was a movie theater in town at the time, but, there just wasn't a tremendous amount. There wasn't a tremendous variety of choices in Cleveland at the time for, you to do stuff on a weekend. So I discovered my friends were playing this game, and not wanting to be left out, I said, hey, can I play? And my experience with any type of like fantasy gaming at that point was solely in the realm of a computer game that I played when I was in junior high. This game was put out by Sierra. It was called King's Quest. And my grandparents had a computer. My uncle, I believe, kind of turned us on to the game, my dad and I. And King's Quest was a very basic DOS game. You had like an 8-bit animated character. He walked around on a very two-dimensional, sort of screen, and everything was text-based. You control the character. If you were really high class, really high cotton, you might have had a joystick to control the character. Otherwise, you just use the arrow keys on your keyboard to move him around the screen. And you had to type in commands. So like if you walk into a screen and there's a wishing well, you could tell him to look at the well. And when you say look at the well, then it describes what you see at the well. And from there, it was left for you to figure it out. There was no cheat codes. There was no, how-to, no walkthrough, certainly no YouTube videos of any kind. It was up to you to just sort of trial and error, figure things out using a very sort of basic, limited set of commands: look, go, pick up, use, things like that. And, but, for me, that was enough. I loved King's Quest. I played several of the sequels, King's Quest 2, King's Quest 3. I had a friend named David who had a much better computer than my grandparents. I didn't even have one of my own at the time. And he had King's Quest, eventually 3, 4, and 5. And, he had a computer that had a hard drive on it. My grandparents didn't. It was a Tandy 1000, had a 5 1/4 inch floppy drive. Internal memory now that, not even a modern wristwatch would have. But, yeah, so, that's where I got sort of into the idea of fantasy role playing. And then so I sat down and a friend, Marshall, said, I'll make you a character. And so he sat down and just a very few minutes, whipped out a quick character, handed it to me and said, you're a priest. You worship a god. You can cast these spells, once a day. And so we were off from there, and I just, I feel like I took to it like a duck to water. And, I played a couple of times and I asked to borrow a player's handbook, and I took it home and I read the entire thing, and it's not a page turner. I mean, it's a rule book, but learning how the game worked, learning, how all the spells work, how magic works, how dice play into the game, really sort of, opened up the possibilities of what I could do. And the game itself, it's a collaborative storytelling game. The dungeon master, the person that runs the game, comes up with essentially a setting, and then they, provide cues or prompts for characters to react to. They provide puzzles for the characters to solve. And Dungeons and Dragons was creative. It was social because I'm sitting in a room with 5 or 6 of my closest friends. It was cheap because we didn't have to go out to a bar. We weren't spending, $20 or $30 drinking. We, would go to McDonald's or run to Double Quick. We would grab a bite to eat, bring it back, sit down and play the game. And the game would take up between, 3 or 4 hours typically, sometimes much longer, 8 hours. The longest game I think I've ever, played in or ran was about 11 hours. And that is a stretch, but it's also, you don't feel like it's 11 hours. You look at your watch and go, oh my God, I've been sitting here for half a day. Because it's fun. And it served a real, social, what's the word I want? It served a real social purpose in college. And I had friends that they were going out and partying and getting drunk and doing whatever. And, I did that on occasion. But, I didn't have the money, or the, the physical endurance, to do that on the reg. Plus, that kind of stuff wasn't really, it was fun every now and then, but it wasn't real intellectual, stimulus. It wasn't feeding my hunger to be creative and to solve problems, and while at the same time, doing stuff with friends. So that's what D&D became. So when I learned to play, and I first started playing, and up until recently, what I played was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, commonly known as 2nd Edition Revised. It was one of their biggest products for a long time. Eventually, they came out with Dungeons and Dragons 3.0, and then not long after that, they saw some things that were problematic with it, and they changed it to 3.5. And 3.5 was the standard for a long time. Now, I never really got into 3.5. I played it. There were some things about the changes in the mechanics that I liked, and there were some things about the changes in the mechanics I didn't like. Eventually, they came out with 4th edition. There are some people that like it, I'm sure. I've never met any of those people. But, from what I've heard, the criticisms for 4th edition D&D have been that it really attempted to make the game much more like a computer game, a computer fantasy-based role-playing game that you were just playing with pencil and paper. And, that was one of the things I didn't like about 3.5, third edition 3.5, was that it seemed to really overcomplicate things. One of the things I loved about second edition was there were a whole bevy of rules, a whole bevy of systems. There were ways to customize things, and they were there as an option if you wanted to use them, but they weren't required. They weren't necessary. You could play the game in a very mechanically simplistic way, which lent itself to a game that was story-based. It was driven by characters and their choices, and the personalities that the people developed for those characters. And it was really interesting. The boring part of the game for me was when a fight broke out, when there was, actual combat or a monster, because everything up to that was just playing pretend. And then once you actually had to resort to using dice in a game, it was exciting because there was a challenge, but it was also, it slowed things down to a certain extent, because now we really have to break out the books and we really have to use the rules and we have to look things up. And, you had to know your stuff inside and out. If you were playing the game, and it wasn't like, it wasn't a shame kind of thing, but it was like if you were in the midst of the game and your character wants to cast a spell, then if you don't know what that spell does and how that spell works, then you have to look it up and, share it. And that kind of slows things down. And when things slow down, it's more like, there's a certain amount of sort of social pressure among the group that, things are humming along pretty good. Everybody knows what they're doing. And now we have to hold on for a second for someone to flip through a book to find a spell description and read a rule and get, a decision made and stuff like that. So, you wanted to know, what your character was capable of and how things worked for the sake of momentum in the story. So recently, over the years, I've had people playing in my game. I started playing, I played with Marshall, starting off with D&D, and then later adding in other role-playing games, Vampire the Masquerade being the other one that we played more often than anything else. And eventually I decided that, I wanted to start running my own games. I started off running with Marshall as a player, a few other people. I found a couple of friends who didn't hang out with Marshall all that much, but they still wanted to play. And so I began to run them. And eventually, when people move away and, college, sort of over, it's sort of weird being the hometown boy going to a hometown college, because you meet all these new friends who have come here from somewhere else. And then after a few years, they leave and go off to somewhere else by and large. And you're, still here in town. Over the years, I, gradually met new people and brought them into my, social circle and had them come join the game. And, they would play for years, and then eventually they would graduate, go off, get married, and then other people would come in. And so there's been sort of this cycle of people that have come in, played in my games over the years, and then sort of graduated, many of whom have gone on to, run their own games for other people. And, I'm proud to say that, Marshall was an excellent DM. He was a great storyteller. Not just dealing with the game, but he had a real talent for telling a story. And that in itself lends itself to being a good dungeon master, or being a good storyteller or game master. Because the whole point of the game is to have fun. And a compelling story is lots of fun. Ups and downs, highs and lows, comedy and tragedy. Nobody remembers the die rolls necessarily. Nobody remembers, oh, I knew about this rule and you didn't, and we got this and da-da-da. People remember the stories. People remember the characters, just like in a novel, just like in a movie, It's not important what kind of magical item a character has or what happens. What's important, is how Samwise defeats Shelob, the giant spider, how that takes place, the story, the epic tale of it. That's what's important to us. And that's what, is really meaningful. That's one of the things I don't like about gaming culture. And also one of the things I don't really love about the new edition, the 5th edition of the game is, and I understand the appeal, I think, but I also don't run my game that way. The game is designed to appeal to lots of different people in lots of different ways. I tend, and I tell people that, I run 5th edition D&D with a 2nd edition skin on it. And that is to say that, there are certain things I don't let happen in my game, certain things that I insist on happening in my game, because they make sense to me. And they're things that I sort of enjoy about the genre. And I think they're sensible. And so, when I invite people, I try to let them know. I was like, look, I like D&D, but I don't let this happen in my game, and I don't let this happen in my game. And you can't play this race with this class at this alignment, because to me, that doesn't make sense, And if you like that, hey, that's cool. Find someone else that likes that, play with them, But for me, there needs to be a certain logic to things. In the newest edition of the game, for example, there's a race. You can play a dragonkin. It might be called something else. I'm not sure. But, you're essentially a bipedal, man-sized dragon. This race is sort of new to the game. And to me, when you think about the fantasy setting, to me, Lord of the Rings is sort of the gold standard of like high fantasy adventure when you're talking about literature, stuff like that. And so, I try to think logistically about the impression that, okay, there's a human. All right. That's me, him. We're both humans. That looks normal. There's an elf. Okay. Well, an elf is not too far of a stretch. It's kind of a skinny human with pointed ears. Okay. Halfling. Oh, well, it's like a short person, or a dwarf. Again, generally human looking, different physical features and proportions for the most part. Then you throw in this 6 foot tall, dragon, like person that's got a dragon's head, dragon teeth, scales, a tail, possibly wings, stuff like that. That to me is jumping the shark, because, the average person seeing that is not just going to go, oh, that's a dragonkin. The average person is going to scream monster, run into the streets, whip up a mob with pitchforks and torches, and take care of this thing that is so far outside of the norm of what they see on a regular basis that it must definitely, it's so foreign that it must be evil, And so, I don't let people play that race in my game. If you're going to play one or something like that, then it would seem like in order for it to not break the setting, that you would have to disguise yourself in a way that, would eventually unravel. I mean, it would eventually become impossible. Someone would find you out and it would become a problem. No, but I mean, that's another thing. I mean, you start talking about your preferences and peculiarities when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, and everyone that plays Dungeons and Dragons is either on your side or thinks you're an idiot. Everyone sort of likes their own brand. And I've had people that I've been, friends with for a long time, and they're like, hey, I'd like to play in this game, and I want to play this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing. And I was like, well, everybody else is sort of just playing this, A, B, and C, whereas you want to play, JKH, Purple 7, Morse code. And it would be better if you picked from A, B, or C. And they got really upset. Just sort of like take their ball and went home, kind of upset. And I mean, to each their own. I'm not saying, I have to like it. I'm just saying that if you want to play in this game with these people that have all agreed to play with, these restrictions and circumstances, that, everyone should, sort of be on the same page. I'm not going to make an exception for you just because, it's your preference to use, this other stuff. I realize this is the second episode that we've talked about Dungeons and Dragons. It will probably not be the last episode that we discuss Dungeons and Dragons. But Dungeons and Dragons is one of those things that I happen to know a lot about and I have a lot of experience with. And it's something that I know some of my listeners, also know a lot about and have very strong opinions about. And if you have strong opinions either for or against any of the sort of topics that I've mentioned, I would love to hear about them. Please comment on Facebook, tweet at me at Learn to Even. It's kind of come up in quarantine because it's also, you're stuck here at home. You can't go out. You can't go to the movies. You can't go to a concert. Going out to dinner is, even just tenuous at best right now. But, most of us have Wi-Fi and most of us have a lot of time to kill. And so it's easy to sit down, open up a Zoom meeting or Google Hangouts or Discord or some other video conferencing device and just spend the time, seeing friends, engaging with them virtually, even though you can't be with them physically, and doing some of the things that, you've done for a long time and love to do. D&D is a great, killer of time. And it's fun, people wouldn't do it if it wasn't fun. I mean, sometimes for some folks, it's an acquired taste. There are more people, I think, probably that get talked into trying it out and get into it than people actively seeking it out. Like, ooh, I've heard of this thing. I've never done anything about it. I really want to try it out. I'm sure there's probably some of that, but it's, I doubt that it's, I doubt that that's the norm. I think it's probably more like, being Southern Baptist. You probably know some Southern Baptists or, Baptists as they are called. I think they might have dropped the Southern from their name. I'm not sure, but like any cult, someone that's in it already likes you and wants you to be a part of it, and they bring you into the fold. And, I'm not saying that, that Baptists are cultists. You can, observe and make that decision for yourself. But what I'm saying is that, Dungeons and Dragons and other activities like that, anything that you enjoy doing and you want to share with other people, it's almost it almost has an evangelical quality about it, where you look at something and go, I like this. It's important to me. It's a lot of fun. I want to share this fun with other people. And so, people that you care about and people that you want to spend time with, you find a way to bring them in. My wife had certainly never played Dungeons and Dragons before she met me, along with a many other number of experiences. And, I was fortunate in the fact that she gave it a try and quickly, picked it up and liked it and loved it. And now, has run at least one game of her own and loves role-playing games in general, especially D&D and Vampire. And, it's something that we can share together. So usually if we can find one or two other people, we can sit down and play a game. And really, that's, I think, what life, at least life here on Earth, is all about, is finding ways to engage with other people that have meaning, that bring joy, that build bridges. Wow, this took a real weird philosophical bent. We went all the way from, scrambled eggs to important lessons about life. And I guess that's the whole point of this podcast. When the world is facing you down and you literally just can't even, that's what we're here for, is to help bring you back into the lane, help you learn to even. That's all we have for tonight. I want to thank you all for listening. Please find us on Twitter, find us on Facebook. We're also on Instagram. Share the podcast with your friends. Bring them in to our cult. No, we're not a cult yet. Who wants to start a cult? Anybody? Cult? Okay, well, anyway, as always, Learn to Even is brought to you by the good people at Noblesque International, making the world better than you deserve, and the fine folks at Mudbug State University. Mudbug State, it's not just good, it's good enough.